Madison Clark was supposed to walk down the aisle and marry the love of her life. James Clark, her father, was supposed to give her away with pride. Nathan Clark, her brother, was meant to stand beside her in support. But by the end of that day, Madison had vanished without a trace, and the secrets her family tried to bury would leave the world in shock. Madison Clark had always been the kind of woman people admired. At 27, she had built a successful career in graphic design, had a circle of close friends, a supportive family, and had just bought a house in the suburbs of Sonoma, California. Her life, as far as anyone could see, was beautiful and full of promise. She met her fiancé, Daniel Ellis, 3 years before her disappearance. Their relationship bloomed quickly, filled with romantic getaways, shared goals, and a mutual love for nature and art. By all accounts, theirs was the kind of love story people dreamed of. So, when they announced their engagement and started planning a vineyard wedding, no one was surprised. Madison was radiant in the months leading up to the big day. Every detail of the wedding had been carefully curated. She had chosen a charming vineyard tucked in the hills of wine country, surrounded by blooming gardens and rows of grapevines. The guest list was modest but meaningful. Close family, lifelong friends, and colleagues who had watched the couple grow together. Madison had picked out a designer dress, reserved a string quartet, and even designed her own wedding invitations. The night before the wedding, the rehearsal dinner was held at a local restaurant. Laughter, toasts, and stories filled the air. Madison smiled the entire evening, hugging guests and thanking them for traveling to be there. There were no signs that anything was wrong. She hugged her parents, Deborah and James Clark, tightly before heading back to the bridal suite at the vineyard. Surveillance footage would later show her entering her suite around 10:15 p.m. The next morning, June 9, 2018, the sun rose over the hills, casting a golden glow across the venue. Vendors began setting up early. Florists arranged bouquets. Chairs were placed, and the catering team prepared hors d'oeuvres. The groom arrived at 11 a.m., dressed in a tailored suit, his best man at his side, his hands trembling slightly with nerves. Guests started to arrive around noon, dressed in pastels and holding gifts. Madison was scheduled to begin getting ready at 10:30 a.m. When the makeup artist knocked on the door of her suite, there was no answer. At first, they assumed she was still asleep or perhaps in the bathroom. After waiting 10 minutes, she tried again. Still no response. Growing concerned, she found a staff member who used a master key to open the door. The suite was empty. Madison's wedding dress still hung on the wall, untouched. Her shoes were neatly placed beneath it. Her makeup bag sat unopened on the counter. Her purse, wallet, and phone were all there. But the phone was powered off. Her luggage hadn't been moved. Nothing looked disturbed. The staff notified Daniel, who quickly ran to the suite. When he saw that everything was still there but Madison was not, his face went pale. He called her phone repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail. Friends tried to reassure him. Maybe she went for a walk. Maybe she needed a moment to herself. But as the minutes turned into an hour and then 2, that optimism faded. The ceremony was supposed to begin at 2 p.m. By 1:30, whispers spread among the guests. The music had stopped. The vineyard coordinator asked everyone to remain seated while they tried to reach the bride. Daniel walked through the grounds, calling her name, hoping she was somewhere nearby, but she wasn't. By 3 p.m., the police were called. The wedding was postponed, and guests were quietly asked to leave. Some stayed behind to help look for Madison. Officers arrived and quickly began searching the surrounding area. Drones were deployed, dogs were brought in, but there was no sign of Madison, no footprints, no tire tracks, no trail leading away from the suite. The only road in or out of. The vineyard had a camera, and no cars had left since that morning, except for vendor vehicles. The disappearance of Madison Clark was treated as high priority from the beginning. Local news picked up the story that same evening. A young bride vanishing just hours before her wedding. It was too strange, too sudden, and far too public to ignore. People across the state began to follow the case. Volunteers from neighboring counties offered to help search. Flyers were posted. Social media flooded with her photo. Madison with long chestnut hair, soft features, and a bright smile. Her image became impossible to avoid. Her parents, Deborah and James, were devastated. They appeared on local news, asking for help, pleading for any information. Deborah sobbed on camera, clutching a photo of Madison in her graduation gown. James, more stoic, thanked the community for their support and insisted that Madison would never run away. He said she had been excited for the wedding, that she loved Daniel, that something terrible must have happened. Speculation spread quickly. Some believed Madison had gotten cold feet. Others wondered if she had a secret no one knew about. The police kept an open mind. They interviewed everyone at the wedding, friends, family, even vendors. They examined security footage, took fingerprints, and swept the suite for evidence. But nothing added up. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry, no indication she had packed a bag or planned to leave. Investigators checked local hospitals, shelters, and hotels. They traced her last phone pings, but the phone had been turned off around midnight the night before. They checked her emails, social media accounts, and bank activity. Everything stopped the moment she vanished. The police began looking closely at those closest to her, beginning with Daniel. But Daniel had been staying at a separate location with his groomsmen. His movements were accounted for. Phone data, surveillance, and witness statements cleared him quickly. He was cooperative and devastated. Attention shifted to Madison's family. Detectives started reviewing her relationships, financial records, and recent behavior. They interviewed Madison's best friend, who mentioned that Madison had seemed distracted a few days before the wedding. Not nervous exactly, just tense. When asked why, the friend couldn't say for sure. Madison hadn't confided anything specific. She had chalked it up to normal pre-wedding jitters. But police took note. In the days following her disappearance, more details began to emerge. The last person to see Madison alive had been a vineyard staff member who delivered a glass of wine to her suite just after 10 p.m. She had been in her robe, calm and alone. Nothing about the interaction raised concern at the time. That small detail, however, would later be crucial. As the days passed, hope began to dim. There were no ransom calls, no credible sightings, and no communication. It was as if Madison Clark had vanished into thin air. Her case, once the subject of national headlines, began to turn cold. But what no one could have guessed then was that the key to Madison's disappearance wasn't a stranger or an accident. It wasn't a runaway story, and it wasn't a last-minute change of heart. It was something far darker and much closer to home. In the days and weeks following Madison Clark's disappearance, the investigation consumed the quiet town of Sonoma. Search teams continued combing the surrounding vineyards and woodlands, but every search ended the same way, with nothing. Her sudden vanishing had started to seem less like a mystery and more like a ghost story. With no clues, no witnesses, and no sign of foul play in her bridal suite, law enforcement began digging into Madison's personal life. They hoped that somewhere in the details, behind the wedding plans and smiling photographs, there might be an answer. To the outside world, Madison had seemed like the embodiment of a perfect life. Her social media feed was filled with images of sunsets, travel, her art, and, more recently, her engagement ring. She shared romantic posts about Daniel, offered motivational quotes, and frequently tagged her friends in cheerful, light-hearted stories. But beneath the filtered images and carefully selected captions, investigators began to notice something strange. Over the last few months, Madison's posts had become less frequent. In private messages to friends, she had started canceling plans more often, citing exhaustion or work stress. Some noticed she had become more withdrawn, and others said she seemed distracted, though they couldn't explain exactly how. Her professional life also seemed to hold a few contradictions. Madison worked as a freelance graphic designer and had built a solid reputation for clean, elegant designs. She worked remotely, had regular clients, and kept a meticulous portfolio. Yet when investigators reviewed her financial records, they noticed inconsistencies. Her bank account showed several large withdrawals within the 2 weeks before the wedding. One in particular stood out. $9,000 had been taken out in cash just 2 days before she vanished. There was no clear reason for this. She hadn't made any major purchases or vendor payments. The venue and all wedding services had already been paid for in full, most of it several weeks earlier. Investigators started to question whether Madison had been planning to disappear on her own. They tracked her internet activity and eventually recovered deleted browser history and email drafts from her laptop. These details painted a far more complicated picture. Among the files were several deleted emails between Madison and an unknown email address. The language was cautious and vague, but suggested she had been planning something significant. In one message, she mentioned feeling trapped and not wanting to go through with it. Another referred to finding a way out before it's too late. While she didn't name anyone specifically, the tone hinted at a desire to leave behind her current life, including possibly the wedding itself. This was a turning point in the investigation. Police now had to consider the possibility that Madison had disappeared willingly. It wasn't a theory anyone wanted to believe, especially Daniel and her family, but it couldn't be ignored. The evidence suggested that Madison had been under more stress than anyone had realized. It became crucial to determine what had been causing that stress. Detectives began interviewing those closest to her again, asking deeper, more uncomfortable questions. What they uncovered next would shake the image of Madison's perfect life. A longtime friend came forward with something she had previously hesitated to share. About a month before the wedding, Madison had shown up at her house unexpectedly, late at night. She looked anxious and had asked if she could stay the night. The friend said Madison seemed shaken, though she wouldn't explain why. She mentioned having a falling out with someone close, and that she was considering postponing the wedding. The next day, Madison left without saying much, and they never spoke about it again. It was the first concrete sign that Madison had been dealing with something serious in the weeks before her disappearance. Meanwhile, the public image of her family began to draw scrutiny. During media interviews, Deborah Clark often appeared overwhelmed and tearful, speaking of her daughters. Warmth, creativity, and kindness. But James Clark, her father, gave off a different energy. Observers noted that his responses in interviews were stiff and guarded. He avoided speaking too much about Madison's emotional state or her recent behavior. While it's not uncommon for people to respond differently to grief, investigators found it suspicious how unwilling he seemed to discuss certain topics. When detectives began looking into James Clark's background, they found several red flags. He had recently filed for bankruptcy after a failed business venture. He had also borrowed large sums of money from friends and family under the pretense of investments that never materialized. His financial situation was far more dire than anyone knew. This raised new questions. Could Madison's disappearance somehow be connected to her father's troubles? Did she know something she wasn't supposed to? The investigation took a darker turn when police obtained a warrant to search the Clarks' home. Among various financial documents, they found something chilling. A life insurance policy taken out on Madison just 6 months earlier. What stood out most was that James Clark was listed as the primary beneficiary. The policy was for $500,000. Madison's signature appeared on the documents, but experts later concluded it had likely been forged. This revelation reframed the entire case. Investigators now had to consider that Madison might not have disappeared by choice at all. If she had recently discovered the forged documents or confronted her father about them, that would have given him a powerful motive. There was also the matter of the large cash withdrawal. Perhaps Madison had planned to escape not from her wedding, but from someone close to her, someone she no longer trusted. The deleted emails, the canceled plans, the night she spent away from home, all of it now seemed to fit a more sinister puzzle. As the media caught wind of these developments, the story exploded. Headlines changed from "Missing Bride" to "Dark Secrets Behind Bride's Disappearance." The public began to speculate wildly. Some believed Madison had tried to flee, but had been stopped. Others were convinced she had been silenced for discovering something dangerous. Rumors flooded social media. Was Madison pregnant? Was someone in her family involved in criminal activity? Did she have an escape plan that had gone horribly wrong? Yet despite these theories, there were still no concrete answers. No security footage had shown her leaving the vineyard. No witnesses had seen her in the hours before the wedding. Her phone and wallet were untouched. Her dress was still hanging in the suite. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no leads. Investigators were running out of time. The trail was growing colder. But behind the scenes, they continued quietly watching James Clark. They monitored his movements, his financial activity, and his communications. They weren't ready to make an arrest, but they were getting closer. They believed the key to solving the case lay within the Clark family, possibly in something Madison had discovered in those final days before her wedding. Whatever it was, it had terrified her enough to consider walking away from everything. She knew. The image of the radiant bride on her wedding day was starting to fade. In its place was a woman who had been carrying a secret too dangerous to share, one that may have cost her everything. 3 months had passed since Madison Clark vanished without a trace, and the investigation had moved quietly into a new phase. Public interest remained high, but media coverage had slowed. Most people assumed the case had gone cold. Behind closed doors, however, detectives had shifted their attention almost entirely to the Clark family. The discovery of the forged life insurance policy, with James Clark listed as the sole beneficiary, had opened a new and troubling theory, one that placed her own father at the center of the investigation. Detectives began reconstructing the timeline of James's financial downfall. His failed tech startup had cost him over $400,000, and creditors were still after him. He had mortgaged the family home twice, pulled out personal loans under various aliases, and had been sued twice by former business partners. To those outside the family, James had always presented himself as a calm, charismatic man with a strong work ethic and quiet confidence. But the records told a different story. He was desperate, reckless, and dangerously close to losing everything. The possibility that he had tried to use Madison's wedding, specifically her disappearance, as a financial escape route became harder to ignore. Despite the mounting suspicions, nothing directly tied James to the vineyard on the night Madison vanished. His alibi, which he repeated without hesitation, was that he had gone back to the hotel early to rest after the rehearsal dinner. Surveillance footage confirmed he entered the hotel around 10:30 p.m. and didn't appear to leave again, but investigators remained skeptical. There were gaps, brief periods where he couldn't be accounted for, such as the time between leaving the dinner and arriving at the hotel. More importantly, they believed someone else might have been involved. If James had orchestrated something, he likely hadn't done it alone. Attention turned next to Madison's younger brother, Nathan. He had kept a low profile throughout the investigation. He hadn't spoken to the media, hadn't attended any public searches, and had given a short, vague statement to police early on. At first, this didn't raise much concern. Nathan had always been quiet and introverted, preferring books and music over social events. But as detectives reviewed Madison's personal journals, a different portrait of her relationship with her brother emerged. Madison had written several entries about Nathan's strange behavior in the months leading up to the wedding. She described mood swings, sudden outbursts, and disturbing conversations. In one entry, she hinted that he had been following her, or watching her from a distance, though she chalked it up to paranoia. Still, she wrote that she didn't feel safe alone with him anymore. When police requested a second interview with Nathan, he hesitated. He finally agreed to meet at a local precinct, but arrived accompanied by an attorney. It was an unusual move for someone who claimed to have nothing to hide. During the interview, detectives pressed him about his relationship with Madison. He responded vaguely, often deflecting or refusing to answer outright. He denied any involvement in her disappearance, but couldn't provide a clear timeline for his whereabouts that night. When asked about the journal entries, he dismissed them as exaggerated and said Madison had been under a lot of stress. Meanwhile, forensic analysts continued examining the few items left behind in Madison's suite. They focused on her cell phone, which had been powered off but not reset. Deep analysis of the device revealed one deleted voice memo recorded 3 days before the wedding. The recording was brief and hard to decipher, filled with background noise. But one phrase stood out: "If anything happens to me, look at my family." The voice was unmistakably Madison's. The discovery of the recording sent shockwaves through the investigation. It confirmed that Madison had felt unsafe, possibly even threatened. It didn't name anyone specifically, but combined with the GIA, life insurance forgery, and the journal entries, it pointed strongly toward someone close to her. Police now believed Madison had been planning to flee, not from her fiancé, not from the wedding, but from her family. It explained the deleted emails, the large cash withdrawal, and her increasingly anxious behavior. She had likely been preparing to disappear, but someone else had beaten her to it. Detectives continued pressing the family, monitoring their communications, and quietly building their case. Then a break came, not from a member of the Clark family, but from someone who had remained silent all along. A former employee of James Clark, a man named Alan Pierce, reached out to investigators. He claimed James had approached him months earlier with a strange request. He wanted help finding someone who could make a problem go away. At the time, Alan thought it was just drunken rambling, but now he wasn't so sure. James had allegedly mentioned an insurance payout and hinted that someone close was standing in the way of his financial recovery. Investigators interviewed Alan formally, and though the evidence was circumstantial, it gave them enough to re-examine James's network of associates. That's when they uncovered a link to a man named Troy Wexler, a former private investigator with a criminal record for intimidation and unlawful surveillance. James had made a large payment to Wexler in cash just days before Madison disappeared. On paper, it looked like a loan repayment, but there were no prior records of any loan. When detectives tried to locate Wexler, they discovered he had recently left the state. Now, with a second suspect in mind, authorities issued a warrant for Wexler's arrest and searched his last known residence. Among the clutter of documents and receipts, they found a burner phone with several deleted text messages, one of which read, "Room 203, be quiet, no mistakes." The timestamp on the message matched the night Madison vanished. Police now believed Madison had been forcibly removed from the suite, likely by Wexler or someone he had hired. The crime had been planned with precision. There was no struggle, no noise, no damage to the room. She had likely been taken quickly and quietly before she had the chance to fight back. Investigators feared she may have been killed shortly afterward and buried or hidden somewhere remote. But without a body, no charges could be filed, and James Clark continued to deny everything. Still, the walls were closing in. Forensic accountants began tracking the cash withdrawals James had made around the same time. Patterns emerged, and connections were drawn. Madison's disappearance, once thought to be a tragic mystery, was now looking more and more like a calculated scheme, a plan designed to eliminate a perceived threat to a desperate man's future. But just when the investigation seemed ready to move forward with arrests, another unexpected discovery sent everything in a new direction. A delivery driver working in rural Mendocino County, over 100 miles north of Sonoma, reported seeing a woman matching Madison's description walking near a remote hiking trail. She had looked disoriented and dirty, but alive. He didn't think much of it until he saw her face on a missing person flyer days later. Authorities immediately dispatched search teams to the area. It was a long shot, but it changed everything. If the sighting was real, it meant Madison had survived. It meant she might still be out there, hiding from something or someone. And most of all, it meant the truth about what had happened that night might still come from Madison herself. For the first time since the investigation began, the possibility that Madison Clark was still alive ignited a renewed sense of urgency. The delivery driver who had reported the sighting was credible, with no prior criminal history or motive to fabricate the claim. He described the woman in detail, a slender build, tangled brown hair, barefoot, and wearing what looked like a torn white dress or long shirt. She appeared dazed, as if she had been lost for days. When he slowed his truck to ask if she needed help, she turned and walked quickly into the dense forest. At the time, he assumed she was a confused hiker, but the moment he saw her missing person poster days later, everything changed. Law enforcement wasted no time. Search teams were deployed to the Mendocino County area where the woman had been seen. The region was vast and heavily wooded, with steep trails, hidden caves, and limited cell reception. It would take days to search thoroughly, and even then, it was like looking for a shadow in the wilderness. Helicopters flew overhead, using infrared cameras to detect body heat. Drones were launched to access rugged terrain, and volunteers joined officers in grid-style ground searches. But as the days passed, the woman was never spotted again. No clothing, no campsite, no tracks. Some began to wonder if the sighting had been a mistake, or worse, a hallucination. But investigators weren't ready to let go of the possibility. They returned to Madison's digital footprint, looking for anything that might suggest she had a reason to flee to such a remote location. That's when they discovered a journal entry stored in a cloud backup from over a year ago. In it, Madison had written about a hiking trip she took alone to clear her mind. She mentioned finding a small, secluded cabin owned by a retired park ranger who had offered her water and food. She described the experience as peaceful and grounding, saying it was the only place I've ever felt truly safe. The location wasn't named, but she noted it was miles from civilization and near a river that curves like a question mark. Investigators began cross-referencing maps of the area with water formations and eventually identified a place that matched Madison's description. It was close to where the delivery driver had reported the sighting. With renewed hope, they redirected search efforts toward the new location, this time with focused determination. After 2 more days of combing the landscape, searchers found what looked like an abandoned camp, a fire pit surrounded by stones, scraps of cloth tied to tree branches, and a small handmade sign stuck into the dirt. Scratched onto a piece of bark were the words, "Don't trust them." It wasn't confirmation, but it was enough to believe someone, possibly Madison, had been there. Meanwhile, the investigation into James Clark intensified. With mounting circumstantial evidence, detectives now had the beginnings of a conspiracy case. They traced money transfers from James to a third party, believed to be linked to Troy Wexler, the former private investigator who had vanished shortly after Madison's disappearance. Financial records showed that James had withdrawn a total of $38,000 over several months before the wedding. The last large withdrawal was made 2 days prior, almost the exact amount Madison had taken out herself. Investigators theorized that Madison had discovered the insurance forgery and intended to confront her father or escape. James, desperate and cornered, may have planned to silence her before she could expose him. Then came another breakthrough. A forest ranger in Mendocino County found an old cabin nearly overtaken by vines and moss. It was half collapsed and surrounded by thick brush. But inside, on the dusty floorboards, was a torn piece of cloth that appeared to match the lining of Madison's rehearsal dress. Near the cabin's fireplace was a half-empty backpack containing a granola bar wrapper, a rusted flashlight, and a handwritten note. "I'm not crazy, I just know what they did." Though the handwriting was faint, it resembled Madison's. Forensic analysis later confirmed the backpack contained her fingerprints. The discovery of the cabin was a critical turning point. Investigators were now nearly certain that Madison had fled, likely under duress. She had prepared to survive off-grid, far from anyone who might find her, including her family. But the question remained, how had she escaped the vineyard undetected? All known exits had been accounted for. Surveillance footage showed no trace of her after the rehearsal dinner. Investigators re-examined every second of security tape from the property and finally noticed something peculiar. One of the maintenance workers had used a service entrance located at the back of the venue around midnight, a door with no camera coverage. The man, Elias Franco, had been hired temporarily to assist with wedding preparations. When questioned again, he admitted he had seen a woman who looked like the bride waiting near the service entrance that night. He had assumed she was stepping out for air or to meet someone privately. She hadn't spoken to him, just nodded and slipped into the shadows. He didn't think anything of it at the time, but when pressed, he admitted that she seemed scared and glanced over her shoulder before disappearing down the path. This was the missing piece. Madison had likely used the service exit to flee, possibly with help, or perhaps after sensing imminent danger. She had vanished into the night, taken only what she could carry, and made her way over 100 miles to the last place she felt safe. The theory that she had been abducted now seemed less likely. Instead, she had run. But if Madison had escaped, what had she been running from? The answer still pointed to her family, and more specifically, to the web of manipulation woven by her father. James Clark was finally brought in for formal questioning. Faced with mounting evidence, he remained stoic, neither confirming nor denying the allegations. But when shown a copy of the note found in the cabin, "Don't trust them," something in his expression shifted. He asked to speak to a lawyer and ended the interview. While prosecutors prepared to build a case against James for fraud and conspiracy, investigators still had one goal left: find Madison. The forest offered clues, but no confirmation of her current condition. Then one evening a woman stumbled into a ranger station located miles from the main trail. She was malnourished, dehydrated, and sunburned. Her clothes were torn, and her eyes were wide with fear. She identified herself softly as Madison Clark. She was immediately taken to a hospital under police protection. News of her reappearance spread like wildfire, stunning the nation. After months of speculation, false leads, and fear, Madison was alive. But what she had to say would be even more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Madison Clark's reappearance sent a shockwave across the country. For months, her face had been on missing posters, social media feeds, and evening news reports. Most people assumed she was dead. But now the bride who vanished hours before her wedding was alive, and her story was about to change everything. The public thought they knew. Madison was placed under medical supervision immediately after she arrived at the ranger's station. She was severely dehydrated, had lost nearly 20 pounds, and showed signs of long-term exposure to the elements. Doctors confirmed she had no visible injuries, but displayed symptoms consistent with trauma and psychological stress. She spoke very little in the first 48 hours, and the first time she was asked what had happened to her, she only whispered one word: betrayal. After a few days of rest and treatment, detectives were cleared to interview her. She agreed, but only under the condition that the conversation be recorded and that no member of her family would be allowed to contact her. Sitting quietly in a hospital room, Madison began to piece together the story that had remained hidden for so long. According to her statement, Madison had discovered something weeks before the wedding that made her question everything she knew about her family. It began with a document, an unsigned copy of a life insurance policy hidden among her father's office files. It named her as the insured and her father, James Clark, as the sole beneficiary. The payout was substantial, over $500,000. At first, she thought it was a mistake, but as she dug deeper, she realized it had been submitted using her forged signature. That discovery led her down a darker path. She found old emails between her father and a man she didn't recognize, Troy Wexler. The messages were vague but chilling. Phrases like "eliminate the issue," "time-sensitive," and "clean," and "quiet" appeared repeatedly. They read more like instructions than casual correspondence. Madison didn't know exactly what they were planning, but she was convinced that she was the target. She described feeling watched, followed even in her own home. Her belongings had been moved slightly, emails deleted without her knowledge, and private messages from her fiancé never reached her. Terrified and unsure who to trust, Madison quietly began planning an escape. She withdrew cash in small amounts, purchased a prepaid phone, and studied maps of remote locations she had visited in the past. Her plan was to disappear after the rehearsal dinner, just long enough to figure out the truth and gather evidence. But on the night of her planned departure, things went wrong. Someone had already figured out what she was trying to do. She left the venue through the service exit shortly after midnight, just as the staff were packing up. She saw a figure standing near the trees, tall, wearing a dark hoodie. She couldn't see their face, but she believed they were waiting for her. Instead of approaching the figure, she ran in the opposite direction, cutting through the vineyard and into a nearby field. From there, she used back roads and hidden trails she had mapped out ahead of time. For days, she traveled on foot, hiding during the day and moving at night. She avoided gas stations, didn't use her phone, and drank from streams. It took her over a week to reach the remote area in Mendocino County where she had once found peace. For weeks, she survived off foraged food, the contents of her emergency pack, and what little she could find in the ruins of an old cabin. She built makeshift alarms using tin cans and string, fearing that someone might come after her. At one point, she claimed to have seen the same man from the vineyard searching nearby, lurking in the woods just beyond the cabin's clearing. That's when she wrote the notes investigators would later find. "Don't trust them," and "I'm not crazy, I just know what they did." Eventually, her supplies ran out, and the isolation began to take its toll. When she saw the delivery truck weeks later, she almost approached it but feared it might be a trap. Only after she collapsed near the ranger station, starving and weak, did she allow herself to be found. Her full statement was enough to reopen the case in a new light. Law enforcement arrested James Clark the following week, charging him with insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and obstruction of justice. Forensic investigators combed through his bank records and communications, uncovering damning evidence that connected him directly to Troy Wexler, who was still on the run. Wexler's phone records and text messages made it clear that he had been hired to handle Madison. How exactly, he never specified in writing. Authorities believe he intended to abduct her or force her disappearance, but Madison's early escape derailed the plan. In a surprising twist, investigators also found evidence implicating Nathan Clark, Madison's brother. Though he hadn't participated directly in the disappearance, he had been aware of the plan and had withheld information from investigators. Emails between him and his father revealed that Nathan had known about the life insurance policy and had been promised part of the payout in exchange for his silence. He was arrested and charged with conspiracy after the fact and obstruction of justice. The public reaction to Madison's survival was overwhelming. News outlets flooded her story across every platform. "The bride who outsmarted her killers," some headlines read. But for Madison, there was no relief in fame. She declined all interview requests, issued no public statement beyond what was required for the investigation, and disappeared into witness protection under a new identity. Her former fiancé, Andrew, was cleared of any wrongdoing and expressed nothing but heartbreak and support in a written statement. He had believed she left him without explanation. The truth left him shattered. The trial of James Clark began nearly a year after Madison's reappearance. He maintained his innocence throughout, claiming the evidence had been twisted and that he was being framed. But with Madison's testimony, financial records, the forged documents, and digital correspondence, the jury took little time to deliver a verdict. James was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Nathan Clark received a reduced sentence after agreeing to cooperate fully with prosecutors. To this day, no one knows exactly how close Madison came to being killed, or what Wexler's final plan really was. Despite numerous search efforts, he was never captured. Authorities believe he may have fled the country. His name remains on the FBI's most wanted list, and Madison remains under protective surveillance, just in case. The story of Madison Clark became more than a headline. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the greatest threats don't come from strangers, but from within the home. Her courage, her instinct, and her determination saved her life. And though she lost her old identity, her family, and the future she thought she had, she emerged with something no one expected: the truth. A truth that shook a community, destroyed the facade of a respectable family, and ultimately gave her the freedom to start again.